It was a warm afternoon, and Jalen was walking home from school, carrying his backpack. His school wasn't far from his house, so he usually took the same route every day. It was a quiet street, lined with tall trees that shaded the sidewalks. He didn't expect anything unusual to happen. He liked walking by himself. It gave him time to think about his day. But today was different. As Jalen walked down the street, he noticed a police car slowly driving toward him. He didn't think much of it at first. Police cars passed by all the time in his neighborhood. But this one didn't just drive past. It stopped right in front of him. The officer inside rolled down the window, staring at Jalen with a serious look on his face. "Hey, you," the officer called out. Jalen stopped and turned to face the officer. He felt a little uneasy, unsure of what the officer wanted. "Yes," Jalen replied, trying to keep his voice calm. The officer stepped out of the car and walked toward him. Jalen noticed that the man was tall and built, wearing a dark blue uniform. His boots made a heavy sound as he walked on the pavement, and the way the officer looked at him made Jalen feel like something wasn't right. "I need to talk to you," the officer said, his voice firm. "What are you doing here? Where are you going?" Jalen took a step back, trying to keep his cool. "I'm just walking home from school," he said, pointing down the street toward his house. "It's just a few blocks that way." The officer didn't seem to care. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the area like he was looking for something or someone. Jalen started to feel nervous. He had no idea why this officer was suddenly stopping him. "You look like you're up to something," the officer said, his tone turning sharp. "What's in that backpack?" Jalen was taken aback. He wasn't carrying anything illegal or strange, just books and his lunchbox. "It's just my school stuff," he said, raising the backpack slightly so the officer could see. But the officer wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I'm going to need to check it," he said. Jalen froze. He didn't know why, but something in the officer's voice made him feel like this wasn't just a simple stop. There was a tension in the air that Jalen couldn't explain. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the officer's forceful manner made him feel like he was being treated like a criminal. "No, sir," Jalen said, taking a deep breath. "You can't just search my bag. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's expression darkened. "Are you giving me trouble?" he asked, stepping even closer. Jalen felt his heart start to race. He had to do something to stay calm. The officer was towering over him now, and Jalen could see the frustration building in his face. "I'm not giving you trouble," Jalen said, his voice shaking just a little. "I'm just trying to go home." But before Jalen could say anything else, the officer suddenly reached out, grabbing Jalen's arm. Jalen felt a rush of panic. His mind raced. What was going on? Why was this officer being so aggressive? And then something inside Jalen clicked. He remembered something his dad had told him many times before. "If anyone ever gives you trouble, remember who you are and stand tall." Jalen's dad was an important man in the city. He worked in law enforcement and had a high position in the department. Jalen knew that his dad had a lot of respect in the community. It was time to use that knowledge. Taking a deep breath, he looked up at the officer and said something that made the officer stop in his tracks. "My dad is your boss," Jalen said, his voice steady and clear. The officer froze, his hand still holding onto Jalen's arm. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Jalen stood tall, his heart still pounding in his chest, but something in him felt different now. He had just said something powerful, something that seemed to make the officer rethink his next move. The officer slowly let go of Jalen's arm, a stunned look crossing his face. He didn't say anything. Instead, he took a step back, staring at the boy in disbelief. Jalen could see the officer was unsure of what to do next. The tense moment stretched on, and Jalen couldn't help but wonder if he had just changed everything. The officer stood there, staring at Jalen for what seemed like a long time. Jalen didn't know if the officer was trying to figure out if he was telling the truth or if he was just shocked. Either way, Jalen knew this was his chance to stay calm and stand his ground. His dad had always taught him to handle tough situations with confidence. But the officer didn't say a word. He just kept looking at Jalen, his face unreadable. Jalen could feel his heart beating faster. What if the officer didn't believe him? What if this situation didn't end well? Finally, the officer cleared his throat and shook his head. He pulled out his radio from his belt and pressed a button, speaking into it. Jalen could hear the officer's voice, but it wasn't clear what he was saying. The words were muffled and distant. Jalen didn't know if the officer was calling to verify what he had said or if he was just making sure he wasn't lying. Either way, it made Jalen even more nervous. The officer was silent for a moment, listening to the voice coming through the radio. Jalen waited, watching the officer closely. The tension in the air felt thick, like something was about to snap. He couldn't help but wonder if this whole thing would turn into something much worse. The officer's face changed slightly as he nodded to the radio, his eyes still locked on Jalen. But before the officer could say anything, Jalen decided to speak up again. "I'm just trying to go home," Jalen said, his voice steady but with a hint of frustration. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officer's eyes flicked toward Jalen, and for a second, Jalen saw a flicker of uncertainty in the officer's gaze. It was the first time the officer didn't seem so sure of himself. That moment gave Jalen hope, but it also made him more worried about what might happen next. The officer finally turned away and walked back to his police car. Jalen could see the officer speaking into the radio again, his tone urgent but still controlled. The situation seemed to be calming down a little, but Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't quite over. As the officer walked back and forth near his car, Jalen stood still, trying to figure out what to do next. He had no idea how long he would have to wait for the officer to finish what he was doing. But Jalen wasn't going to make things worse by running or getting upset. He had to stay composed. A few minutes passed, but to Jalen, it felt like hours. The sun was beginning to set, and the street grew quieter, with only the occasional sound of a car passing by. Jalen glanced down the street, knowing his house was just a few blocks away, but he couldn't move yet. He had to see how this would play out. Finally, the officer returned to him, his radio turned off. He looked a little less tense, but his face was still serious. "I'm going to let you go, kid," the officer said, his voice low and controlled. "But you should be careful. People might start to question your story." Jalen didn't know what the officer meant by that, but he was relieved to hear that he was finally free to go. The officer didn't try to stop him as Jalen began walking away, heading toward home. But as Jalen walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The officer hadn't apologized or explained why he had stopped him in the first place. Jalen didn't know if that would matter later, but for now, he just wanted to get home. He turned the corner and kept walking, the encounter still fresh in his mind. What had just happened? Why had the officer acted that way? And more importantly, what would happen if someone else found out about this? Jalen kept walking, his mind racing. His body was still tense from the encounter with the officer, and he couldn't help but replay the events over and over in his head. The way the officer had stopped him, the coldness in his voice, the tension that seemed to build between them. Jalen had barely been able to keep his cool, but somehow he had. And now he was free to go home. He turned the corner at the end of the block, feeling the weight of the moment slowly starting to lift. But the more Jalen thought about it, the more he realized something didn't sit right with him. The officer had never explained why he had stopped him in the first place. He hadn't even apologized for the way he treated him. Jalen couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He had never been in a situation like this before. It wasn't just the officer's behavior that bothered him. It was the way everything had felt so wrong, like he was being treated differently just because of who he was. But then, as Jalen walked along the sidewalk, he remembered something important. His dad. His dad worked in law enforcement, and Jalen had always known he held a high position. What had started as a scary situation had turned into something much bigger. Jalen's dad was well known in the community, and the officer had backed off the moment Jalen mentioned him. That meant something. As Jalen walked further, he started to think about his dad's job. His dad wasn't just anyone. He had worked hard to get where he was, and everyone in town knew who he was. Jalen had always admired his dad for the way he carried himself. But today, things felt different. The officer hadn't just been surprised. He had been scared. And that made Jalen feel uneasy. Jalen had heard stories about how power worked in the world. People used their positions for all sorts of things, some good and some bad. His dad had always taught him that power should be used to protect people, not to hurt them. But the way the officer had acted was a reminder that not everyone used their power in the right way. Jalen couldn't help but feel a little strange about the way the officer froze when he said, "My dad is your boss." It wasn't just the shock on the officer's face. It was the way his attitude completely changed. The officer had gone from aggressive to hesitant in an instant. And now, Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than he realized. As Jalen continued walking, the thoughts kept swirling in his mind. What if the officer had been doing something wrong? What if he had been unfair or had a personal issue with Jalen's dad? Jalen didn't know the answers, but he was starting to see how easily power could shift things, how it could protect or destroy in the blink of an eye. By the time Jalen reached his front door, he was more confused than ever. He had just been through something that wasn't only about him. It was about the world around him, and how people in power made decisions. He didn't know what he could do about it, but he knew this encounter had changed him. With one final look behind him, Jalen stepped inside his house. He didn't know how to explain everything to his mom or his dad, but he knew he needed to talk about it. The situation wasn't over. He could feel it in his gut. Something was brewing, and he couldn't just forget about it. When Jalen walked inside his house, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that followed him. It was like a heavy weight on his chest, pressing him to think about what had just happened. He kicked off his shoes and set his backpack down in the hallway, but nothing felt normal. The officer's words, the tension, and the strange way everything had turned around still haunted him. Jalen's mom was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. She glanced up when Jalen walked in, but she didn't seem to notice the strange look on his face. "Hey, how was school?" she asked cheerfully, chopping vegetables on the counter. Jalen didn't answer right away. He was still caught up in the events from earlier, trying to make sense of them. His mom noticed the silence and paused what she was doing. "What's wrong, Jalen?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "You seem off." Jalen hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, but he knew he had to talk about what had happened. He sat down at the kitchen table, looking at his mom as she finished cutting the vegetables. "Mom, something weird happened today," Jalen said slowly, trying to find the right words. "I was walking home from school, and a cop stopped me." His mom raised an eyebrow. "A cop? What did he want?" "He just stopped me for no reason. He was acting all strange and mean. I don't know why he did it. He started asking all these questions and was really pushy, like I had done something wrong. He even grabbed my arm." His mom's face hardened at the mention of the officer's actions. "What? Did you tell him who you were? What happened then?" Jalen nodded. "I said, 'My dad is your boss,' and he just froze. He didn't say anything after that. He looked like he didn't know what to do." His mom put down the knife she was holding and walked over to him, her expression serious. "Jalen, are you sure? You think this cop didn't know who your dad was?" "I'm sure," Jalen said, his voice steady. "He looked shocked when I said it, and he didn't even try to stop me when I walked away." His mom sighed and sat down across from him. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Finally, she spoke. "Jalen, your dad's position in the department does give him a lot of influence, But that doesn't mean that all cops follow the rules. There are some officers who might act differently. Maybe this one thought he could push you around because he didn't recognize you at first. Jalen nodded slowly, taking in his mom's words. He had been so focused on what had happened that he hadn't thought about it from the officer's perspective. Maybe the officer didn't realize who he was at first, or maybe he thought Jalen was just another kid to hassle. I guess I just didn't expect it to happen like that, Jalen said quietly. I thought the police were supposed to help people, not scare them. His mom gave him a gentle smile. The police should protect people. That's true. But sometimes, not everyone in uniform does the right thing. You have to be careful, Jalen. If you ever feel like you're being treated unfairly, always stay calm and remember who you are. You have the right to speak up for yourself. Jalen felt a little better hearing his mom's reassurance, but the feeling of doubt still lingered in his mind. What if that officer had been doing something wrong? What if his dad's position hadn't been enough to stop the officer from making a bad choice? I'll talk to your dad about this, his mom said, breaking his thoughts. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. As Jalen nodded, he felt a small sense of relief. Maybe his dad could do something about it. Maybe this was all just a misunderstanding, and the officer would be more careful next time. But deep down, Jalen knew that something still wasn't right. The officer's sudden change in behavior, the way he froze when Jalen mentioned his dad. It all felt too strange. There was more to this story than he realized, and he couldn't ignore that feeling. The next morning, Jalen woke up early. His thoughts about the officer's strange behavior kept swirling in his mind. He couldn't focus on his homework or the usual routine. It was like something was nagging at him, making him feel unsettled. He knew that the previous day's encounter with the officer was more than just a strange moment. It was a sign that things weren't always as simple as they seemed. As Jalen ate breakfast, his mom mentioned that his dad would be home later that evening. His dad worked long hours at the department, so it wasn't unusual for him to come home late. Jalen wasn't sure if he should bring up the officer again, but part of him felt like he needed to. This wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about understanding the world around him. After school, Jalen decided to take the long way home. He didn't want to be caught off guard by another officer or a strange situation. It was a quiet walk, and the sun was shining down on the neighborhood, but it didn't make him feel any more relaxed. In fact, he felt more anxious, like something was about to happen. He had been walking for a few minutes when he heard a car pull up beside him. Jalen's heart skipped a beat as he looked over his shoulder. He saw the same police car from the day before. The officer was behind the wheel again, and his face looked different now, less angry, more guarded. Jalen's instincts told him to keep walking and ignore the officer. He wasn't in trouble. He hadn't done anything wrong. But he couldn't help but feel like something was coming. The officer slowed the car and rolled down his window. "Hey, kid," the officer called out, his voice much calmer than the day before. "Can we talk for a minute?" Jalen stopped, unsure of what to do. He didn't want to make things worse, but he wasn't sure what this officer wanted now. Yesterday, the officer had treated him like a criminal, but today, he seemed different. "What's up?" Jalen asked, trying to sound casual, though his nerves were still on edge. The officer sighed and looked out the window for a moment, almost like he was trying to gather his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "Listen," the officer said, "about yesterday. I'm sorry for how I acted. I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable. I was out of line." Jalen stood there, surprised. He hadn't expected the officer to apologize. He had been preparing for another confrontation, but this was different. The officer's voice was softer now, and he wasn't acting aggressive. "I was just doing my job," the officer continued, his eyes meeting Jalen's, "but I shouldn't have treated you like that. I was wrong. I've been doing this job for a long time, but I made a mistake. I let my frustration get the best of me." Jalen felt a little relieved, but he wasn't sure what to say. This was the officer from yesterday, the one who had almost made him feel like a criminal. Now he was apologizing, but it felt strange. Why did it take him until today to apologize? I understand if you're still upset, the officer added. I just wanted you to know that I respect your dad. And I respect you. I shouldn't have let things get out of hand. Jalen nodded, his feelings still mixed. On one hand, he appreciated the officer's apology, but on the other hand, he couldn't forget how quickly the situation had escalated, how easily the officer had tried to overpower him. Thanks, Jalen said quietly, but you should still be more careful next time. The officer gave a small nod, then drove off, leaving Jalen standing there on the sidewalk. The apology didn't feel entirely sincere to Jalen, but at least it was something. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he couldn't just forget what had happened. As Jalen continued his walk home, he started thinking more about the officer's words. Maybe the officer had realized that he had crossed a line. Maybe he was trying to make things right. But there was still something that didn't sit right with Jalen. Why had the officer been so quick to act the way he had? And why had it taken an apology for everything to change? Jalen didn't know, but he was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about the officer's actions. It was about how power and respect played a role in how people treated each other. The next few days were strange for Jalen. He tried to focus on school and his usual routine, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the officer's apology. At first, he had been relieved to hear the officer admit that he had acted out of line. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something still didn't feel right. Jalen's dad hadn't come home yet, and Jalen wasn't sure if he should bring up the incident. It wasn't like his dad didn't have enough on his plate already, working so hard in the department. Jalen knew his dad was busy, but he also knew that his dad cared about him. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. One afternoon, Jalen was sitting in his room when his phone buzzed. It was a message from his best friend, Marcus. Yo, Jalen, did you hear? That cop who stopped you, he's been acting strange at work. People are talking about him. Jalen felt a chill run down his spine. What does he mean by strange? He didn't know what to think, but his curiosity got the better of him. He quickly texted Marcus back, asking for more details. He's been on edge, man. A few of the other officers said he was nervous after you mentioned your dad, like he was worried. They think he might have been trying to do something bad. Jalen's heart skipped a beat. Was it possible? Had the officer been planning something? It didn't make sense. He had been so focused on getting out of the situation that he hadn't stopped to think about the officer's possible motives. What if the officer had done something wrong that no one knew about? That evening, Jalen decided to talk to his dad. He couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't over. He needed to understand what was really going on. When his dad came home, Jalen found him sitting at the kitchen table, going over some paperwork. His dad smiled when he saw Jalen, but Jalen couldn't shake the tension in his own body. Hey, Dad, Jalen said, sitting down across from him. Can we talk for a minute? His dad looked up, a little surprised by the seriousness in Jalen's voice. Of course, son. What's on your mind? Jalen hesitated, wondering how to bring it up. But he couldn't wait any longer. About the cop that stopped me last week, Jalen began. His dad's face immediately grew serious. What about him? Jalen took a deep breath. Well, he apologized to me. But there's something weird about it. I've been hearing that he's been acting strange at work. Like people are talking about him being nervous after what happened. His dad sat back in his chair, considering Jalen's words. What do you mean by acting strange? Jalen explained what Marcus had told him about the officer being on edge, looking nervous and worried. He also mentioned how some of the other officers seemed to think something was off with the way the cop had treated him. His dad didn't say anything at first, his face thoughtful as he processed everything Jalen had said. Jalen, his dad said finally, it sounds like the officer was already under some pressure before you even met him. If he was nervous or acting strangely, it could be a sign that something was bothering him. Something that had nothing to do with you. But you're right to be cautious. I'll look into it. Jalen felt a little relieved to hear his dad's response, but he knew the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. If there was something going on behind the scenes, Jalen didn't want to let it go without getting to the bottom of it. Do you think I should talk to anyone about it? Jalen asked, still unsure of what the next step was. Not yet, his dad replied. Let me handle it for now. We need to make sure everything is clear, and I'll take care of talking to the right people. But Jalen, remember this. You're always allowed to speak up when something feels wrong. The next few days felt tense. Jalen couldn't stop thinking about the officer and the strange way he had acted. It wasn't just the officer's apology that bothered him. It was everything that had happened before and after. The more Jalen reflected, the more he felt something was being hidden, something that nobody was talking about. Jalen's dad had said he would look into it, but Jalen didn't want to sit and wait. He wanted answers now. Was the officer really just nervous, or was there something more going on behind the scenes? The questions weighed heavily on his mind as he went through the motions of school and daily life. It was a Friday when Jalen finally got the chance to talk to his dad again. He had been quiet the whole week, waiting for his dad to say something, but nothing had been mentioned. That afternoon, Jalen decided he couldn't wait any longer. Dad, Jalen said as they sat down for dinner, did you find out anything about that officer? His dad paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked up at Jalen, then back down at his plate. Jalen could tell his dad had been thinking about it, but he wasn't sure how much he was willing to share. I've been looking into it, his dad replied carefully. Turns out that officer has been under some personal stress. He's been struggling with some things in his life, things that have been affecting his work. Jalen listened closely, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. He hadn't expected his dad to say that. The officer's strange behavior started to make sense now, but it didn't explain everything. But that doesn't mean what he did was right. Jalen's dad continued. I spoke to his supervisor and made sure they understand that the way he handled the situation with you was wrong. He shouldn't have treated you that way, no matter what was going on in his life. Jalen felt a little better knowing that his dad had taken the situation seriously, but something still didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just about the officer apologizing. It was about the fact that Jalen had been treated unfairly in the first place, and that couldn't be ignored. So, what happens now? Jalen asked. Is he going to get in trouble? His dad sighed and set his fork down. He's been given a warning, and he'll be going through some additional training. But I want you to understand something, Jalen, he said, looking directly at him. Not everyone who wears a badge makes the right choices, but they have to be held accountable for their actions. No one should ever be treated unfairly, especially by someone in a position of power. Jalen nodded. He appreciated his dad's honesty, but the whole situation still felt off. The officer's sudden change in behavior after Jalen had mentioned his dad was still something that stuck with him. Why had the officer been so nervous? What was going on behind the scenes? I'm glad you talked to him, Jalen said, but I still feel like there's more to this. It's just weird, you know. His dad smiled gently, brushing a hand through Jalen's hair. I understand, son. Sometimes people act in ways we don't expect. But that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make the situation any easier. Just know that we've done what we can to make sure it doesn't happen again. Jalen felt a sense of calm wash over him. He trusted his dad. If his dad said it was taken care of, then it probably was. But deep down, Jalen couldn't shake the feeling that the officer's story wasn't finished. Something in the way the officer had apologized, the way he had acted during their encounter, it didn't feel like the end. As Jalen finished his dinner, his mind wandered back to the officer. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen if something like this happened again. Would the officer learn from his mistake? Or was there more to the story that no one was telling? For now, Jalen could only wait and see. But whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to forget what had happened. He couldn't. The days after Jalen's conversation with his dad felt quieter, but they weren't as peaceful as Jalen had hoped. He still couldn't fully shake the uneasy feeling he had about the officer and the strange way the whole situation had unfolded. It seemed like the more Jalen thought about it, the more questions he had. It wasn't long before Jalen heard more news about the officer from his friends. Some of them said they had seen the officer around the neighborhood, but he was acting strangely. Others said they noticed he was no longer as confident as he used to be. It was clear that whatever had happened that day with Jalen was still affecting the officer. Jalen wasn't sure how he felt about it. Part of him felt sorry for the officer. He knew what it was like to go through tough times. But another part of him couldn't forget how unfairly he had been treated. It wasn't just about the officer's apology anymore. It was about how quickly the situation had escalated in the first place. Then, a week later, Jalen's dad sat him down again. This time, the conversation was different. "Jalen," his dad started, his voice serious, "I've spoken to the department about what happened with the officer. There's been an internal review, and some new things have come to light." Jalen's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what his dad was going to say next, but the tone in his voice made it clear that things were still far from over. "It turns out," his dad continued, "that the officer had been under investigation for some time. There were complaints about his behavior and his actions on duty. The department has decided to suspend him for a period of time while they look into it further." Jalen's mind raced. He had suspected there was more going on, but hearing the truth from his dad felt different. The officer hadn't just made one mistake. He had been under investigation for other issues. It made Jalen wonder how many times the officer had acted unfairly before. "So, what happens now?" Jalen asked, his voice uncertain. "Right now, the officer is suspended, but the department is taking the situation seriously. They're doing a full investigation to figure out what's been going on, and depending on the results, they may take further action," his dad explained. Jalen sat quietly, absorbing the news. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Part of him wanted justice for the way he had been treated, but another part of him wondered if the officer's actions had been a result of something deeper. Had the officer been under pressure, or was this just who he was? Either way, Jalen knew that what had happened couldn't be ignored. "Dad," Jalen said after a moment, "do you think he'll be fired?" His dad took a deep breath. "It's possible, but it's not just about what happens to him. It's about making sure that situations like this don't happen again. People in positions of power need to be held accountable for their actions, and that includes the officer. But it's also about making sure everyone is treated fairly, no matter who they are." Jalen nodded, understanding the weight of his dad's words. He felt proud that his dad had taken action and made sure things were being handled properly. But he also realized that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about making sure that fairness and respect were at the core of how people were treated. As Jalen went to bed that night, he couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. The officer's behavior, his dad's involvement, the department's response. It all felt like one big reminder that the world wasn't always fair. But it also reminded him that people had the power to make things right. Tomorrow, Jalen would keep moving forward, knowing that sometimes standing up for what's right could make a difference. The road wasn't always easy, but it was the only way forward. A few weeks passed after Jalen's dad had spoken to him about the officer's suspension. The news seemed to settle in the neighborhood, and life slowly returned to normal. Jalen tried not to think about the incident too much, but every once in a while, his mind would wander back to that day, the way the officer had stopped him, the tension that filled the air, and the strange way everything had ended. Jalen noticed that the officer's absence was being talked about. People in the neighborhood were wondering what had happened to him, and some even speculated that he might never return to the force. It was clear that his actions had caused a ripple effect, not just within the department, but in the community as well. One afternoon, Jalen found himself walking home from school again. The weather was warm, and the air felt fresh, but there was something different this time. Jalen was more aware of his surroundings, more focused on the world around him. He wasn't as afraid as he had been that day with the officer, but he was still thoughtful, still processing everything he had experienced. As Jalen walked down the street, he spotted his best friend Marcus up ahead, waving at him from the sidewalk. Marcus jogged over to meet him. "Hey, Jalen, you okay?" Marcus asked, noticing the serious look on Jalen's face. Jalen smiled and nodded. "Yeah, I'm good. Just thinking about stuff, you know." "About the cop?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet. Jalen hesitated for a moment. "Yeah, I'm glad things worked out, but it's still hard to understand what happened. I mean, why would he treat me like that in the first place?" Marcus thought for a second before replying. Maybe he was just having a bad day. But still, no excuse for how he acted. "Glad your dad stepped in, though." Jalen agreed. "Yeah, I'm glad too. I think it showed me something important. It's not just about what happened to me. It's about how things need to be handled when they go wrong. People need to take responsibility for their actions, no matter who they are." Marcus grinned. "Sounds like you've learned a lot from this, Va." Jalen shrugged. "I guess, but there's more to it than just this one officer. It's about fairness for everyone." As they continued walking home together, Jalen realized that this whole experience had changed him. He wasn't the same person he had been before the incident. He had learned how important it was to speak up when something wasn't right, and he had learned the value of standing tall, even when it seemed like the odds were against him. That evening, when Jalen sat down for dinner with his parents, his dad could see the thoughtful expression on his face. He smiled and asked, "How was your day, Jalen?" "It was good," Jalen said, looking up at his dad. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with the officer, and I realized something. It's not just about the person who made the mistake. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. And it's about doing the right thing, even when no one's looking." His dad nodded, clearly proud. "I'm glad to hear that, son. You've grown a lot through all of this, and you've learned something important. Sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing to do, but it's always worth it." Jalen smiled. "Yeah, I get it now." As Jalen finished his dinner, he felt a sense of peace. The events of the past few weeks had been difficult, but they had also been a lesson in courage, fairness, and accountability. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to face whatever came his way, with strength and integrity. The story wasn't just about what had happened with the officer. It was about the lessons Jalen had learned, the growth he had experienced, and the way he had learned to handle difficult situations with grace. And most importantly, it was about how he had stood up for what was right, no matter how hard it was.